Good afternoon, everybody. It's Friday afternoon, the end of a long week for all of us, and I have been inundated in the last few days with queries about COVID-19. How do we isolate? How do we quarantine? When do we test? How do we test? What do we test with? So clearly the third wave is upon us, and clearly there's some confusion. So allow me 2 minutes to just clear some of these miscommunications up. So we are entering the third wave of COVID-19, which means people around us are going to start getting infected, and we need to know when do we have to isolate and quarantine. The term isolation means you have COVID, so it's been proven by a test, whether you're asymptomatic or not, and you have to put yourself in an isolated spot for 10 days. So isolation is 10 days from the onset of symptoms, or 10 days from the positive test result in the case of asymptomatic people. So it's 10 full days. On day 1, you start isolating. On day 11, you can go back to work or school, provided you are well and no longer have a fever or a cough or shortness of breath. You go back on day 11. You do not need to be retested, because by then the viral load is incredibly low and the likelihood of spreading your COVID-19 is almost negligible. Now, quarantining refers to the people who have been in close contact. So remember, that's less than 1.5 meters apart, with less than optimal mask wearing for 15 minutes or more. So if you've been in close contact with someone with COVID-19, you need to quarantine. So this is a precautionary measure in case you get it, so that the spread stops further than yourself or the person you've been in contact with. Quarantining is also a 10-day period from your last contact with the person who has COVID-19. If during those 10 days you become symptomatic and go for a test and you become positive, then you need to then isolate for 10 days from the onset of your symptoms. So even if the person in your household, for example, has COVID and has done their 10 days of isolation, they can go back to work or school. But if you have symptoms, you need to wait for 10 days from the onset of your own symptoms. Okay, so in a household, that can actually become quite a drawn-out event. So isolation is 10 days. Quarantining is 10 days since your last contact, but if you become symptomatic, it's 10 days from the onset of your symptoms for further isolation. Which test do we do? Well, overall, the PCR test is still the most sensitive. It picks up infection slightly earlier, and also can pick up the virus in asymptomatic people, because essentially it takes a tiny bit of genetic material and it amplifies it, so it can pick up small amounts of COVID-19 in your nasopharynx. It needs to be done by a qualified person, as does the rapid test. The disadvantages of the PCR is the turnaround time is a bit longer, 1 or 2 days, and of course it's more expensive. There is a role for the rapid test, from which you can get your results in 15 to 20 minutes. The role is mainly if you are symptomatic. So the rapid test is not good if you're not symptomatic. It's not as good in younger children, so it's less sensitive. But if you have symptoms and need to differentiate, is this just the flu or a cold, or is this COVID and do I need to isolate for 10 days? The rapid test has a very good role to play there. But if you're testing early on and you're asymptomatic, the PCR is better. If you have very mild symptoms, the PCR is better. But if you have got full-blown symptoms of a cold and a flu, the antigen test is good while you are symptomatic. When is the best time to test? So obviously if you're feeling sick, you test. Otherwise, if you are just in quarantine and you want to make absolutely sure that you didn't get it in your 10 days of quarantine, then actually only 7 to 8 days after exposure is the best pickup rate for testing. And remember, if you are quarantining and even during those 10 days you've tested negative, you have to continue with your full 10 days quarantine. We're seeing a lot of people and families going out early because they've had a negative test. This is not right, because you can still get COVID late on day 10 after your exposure to a positive person. So let's summarize. 10 days of isolation from the onset of symptoms or a positive test. Then you can go back without a test as long as you're feeling well. Quarantining is also 10 days from your last contact, but if you become symptomatic, that adds on a few days then, because then you have to go into isolation. The PCR test remains the most sensitive, but the antigen test certainly has a role to play if you have full-blown symptoms of some respiratory infection and you want to be able to differentiate, is this COVID or a cold? So keep safe, keep warm, remember to socialize in your small groups, don't do inter-school interactions as far as is possible. Stick to the same old sods that you've been seeing for the last few weeks. We are entering the third wave. Thank you.